But when we talk about revelation and systematic theology, what do we have in mind? What are we thinking about? God making himself known. God revealing things to us, okay? This is God making himself known. God disclosing himself. All right, so how does God make himself known? How does he do this? Through the Spirit. That's a good spiritual answer. All right. True enough, the Spirit is the one active in these things. That's the Spirit's particular calling. How else does God make himself known? Through his word, through nature. All right. We can divide these things up into two basic categories. I touched on this a little bit ago. We're going to go a little further in more detail on this. Make sure we get this thing. Revelation divides out into two kinds. There is general revelation, or what is sometimes known as natural revelation. Examples of this would be what? What are some examples of general revelation or of natural revelation?
Nature.
Very good. All right. What's that?
That's too easy. Thinking too hard. Okay, there's got to be something else.
Well, let's be a little more specific then. You hard thinkers, come on through and help me out here. So, what in nature makes you say, come on, I think there's a God?
Creation. Or how it all began.
Oh, yeah, all right. So you step outside of your tent on a camp out, and you look up at the stars, and you go, whoa. All right? This is the great experience of the camp counselor. You haul the kids out into the dark, and you look up, and you see a gazillion stars, and you can see the Milky Way, and you point out Orion and a few other things, and they go, ooh, the counselor knows his stuff, even though you've exhausted all your knowledge of astronomy with pointing out Orion and Venus, and you're done. All right? But it's enough. And you can even point out where Polaris is with the little trick with Ursus Minor and Ursus Major, and it's pretty cool, and everybody's really impressed, all right? And so you've done your thing, but you look up and you go, wow, look at all the stars, just millions, and just blown away. Or you look at a mountain and you go, wow, look at that. This just couldn't just happen. Or you turn your attention to the minute things, and you get a maple leaf and you start looking at it really closely, and you examine this thing, and you see the intricacy of it, or a feather or something, and you're just blown away by the whole thing. And so you just look at creation, and it screams out, this came from somewhere. That is general revelation. All right? Usually, in our circles, we look at general revelation, and how do we treat it? What's our attitude toward it? You're in awe of the general revelation. All right, from a theological standpoint, how good is general revelation? How much do we pay attention to it? Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like, big deal, so what? It doesn't get you very far. And we have this tendency in our circles to kind of just skate right past general revelation and get to specific revelation, which is the other half of this thing. Specific revelation. And we have a tendency to kind of, who cares about that? Not going to get you very far. This is what matters. But we probably shouldn't zip past it quite so quickly. And it does us good to slow down a little bit and pay attention. And we'll think about why here in just a minute. But let's take a look and unpack this just a little bit more. So, there are classic arguments that have been made for the existence of God. And most of them grow out of a general revelation sort of argument. In other words, if you just look around and pay attention, you have to conclude that God exists. That's kind of the gist of it. And there are classic ways that this has come together. So let's take a look at some of these. One of the classic arguments for the existence of God is known as the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Cosmological. If you had to guess, what does the word cosmological mean?
Having to do with the cosmos.
Exactly. Having to do with the creation or the world. Okay, cosmos is the word world, the whole kind of a thing. So cosmological is saying the very existence of the world points to a God. That's the cosmological argument. This is the one that it gets illustrated. If you were walking through the woods and you happened upon a watch and you picked it up and you were examining the watch, what conclusions would you reach upon examination of the watch? Exactly. This did not just happen. Now, if I'm out walking in the woods and I pick up a rock, do I say, whoa, somebody made this rock? No. But if I pick up a watch, you recognize somebody had to fashion it, put it together, make it work. It came from somewhere. All right? That's the idea of the cosmological argument. You look at stuff and you say, this came from somewhere. It's here. It didn't just happen. There has to be some kind of maker. So if something is, there has to be a maker who made what is. That's essentially the essence of the cosmological argument. That you look around and you see the things that are, and you conclude there has to be a maker. If things exist, there has to be someone who brought these things into existence. So that would be the cosmological argument. Okay? Another classic argument is the teleological argument. Okay? Teleological argument. Teleological comes from the root telos. Telos means goal or end or purpose. And the teleological argument says things are working for a purpose, for a goal. And so this is very similar to the cosmological, but the difference here is you look and you see the kind of purposefulness by which creation functions. And so the plants producing the seeds, there's a purpose in this.
Is this where intelligent design comes in?
Yeah. Intelligent design would be a piece of this. Yeah, and in fact, we need to talk about that. So thanks for bringing that up. We'll talk about that more. So the teleological says there's a design in this. There's a purpose. It's intentional things that are happening. It's not just by random chance. And so the teleological argument says there's a purpose or a goal, and that makes us realize that there really is a God. There really is a God behind this whole thing. So that's coming out of general or out of natural revelation. Both of these tend to be based on what we would call an empirical way of thinking about things. And empirical always means judging, sensing, measuring, looking. It has to do with your senses. Okay? This is the way most Americans tend to function. They're really into the empirical stuff, the evidence you have this way. All right? So these are two classic arguments for the existence of God. That's kind of what's going on here. See, these kind of play together. So the general revelation is, the fact is, can you look at the world and see evidence of God there? Is that fair? Is it true? Sure. You guys are nodding. You're just a little reluctant. You're not sure. You think I'm going to spring one on you. But no, yeah, you can. You look at the world and, yeah, there's something going on here. And the teleological, you see the purposefulness of it. Does that point to a maker? Sure it does. Yeah, these are compelling. They point us in this direction, and it's based on the empirical. You look at things and you come to this kind of conclusion. That's what's going on. And that's sort of what's happening with this intelligent design movement, which is happening right now. It's kind of picking up a little steam maybe, where you have scientists saying, you know what, Darwin doesn't add up, and we're here, and we came from somewhere, and a reasonable explanation, which accounts for the facts, is that there is a designer. And that's what intelligent design is saying, or ID. Intelligent design says there's a maker, there's a designer, there's a creator. Now, is intelligent design the same thing as belief in God the Creator? No, not at all. In fact, intelligent design could be Martians came here and left a tribe, and the whole kind of wild conspiracy things on UFOs. And so originally some UFOs came here and put things together. That's where it came from. That's the designer. That's when they put things together. Or there's this another race of people, and we're just a plaything. You're to Twilight Zone, sort of stuff, where you got the guy who's playing in the sandbox of the kid, and the kid's just manipulating him like a G.I. Joe figure, and no, this is not real. That's kind of dee sort of stuff. And so intelligent design has room for that. But the point is with intelligent design that it didn't just happen. There's someone there. And what you have to realize is this. For Christians, intelligent design is interesting. But it's not the same thing that we're saying. Okay? More on that in a minute. All right. So we got the cosmological, we got the teleological. Another argument is the historical. So that if you look at history, and you see the motion of history and the movement of history and how things have happened, you begin to realize things are happening in a purposeful way. And things are working and advancing toward a goal, and things are working generally for the betterment of things, so that God shows up in history. And the fact that this is being directed is an evidence of God because it's God-driven. It's not just happening by chance. There is a plan. That's the historical argument. And you get that just kind of by looking around and observing things as well. You see how things work out.
Good question.
Mm-hmm.
With mutation and all that kind of stuff, how does that, you said that's God-driven, so where would,
Historical
from a
argument is,
scientific point of view,
the historical argument is arguing more from the history of man and not looking at like a Darwinian kind of evolutionary thing. That's not what it's interested in. It's more looking at the rise of empires, the fall of empires.
more of a sociological?
Yeah, more of a sociological thing. So, the Third Reich gets defeated. That's a good thing. Maybe there's God's hand in this. Right triumphs, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
That's what it's looking at more. Okay? Good question. All right? So that would be the historical argument. Another argument for this gets you made for why God must be there, and that does grow out of general revelation, is the moral argument. The moral argument. And this one works this way, that there is, across the board, a basic agreement among human beings about what is right and what is wrong. It's just there. And so then the argument goes that it's there for a reason. God put it there. So it doesn't matter where I go in the world, murder is wrong. Doesn't matter where I go in the world, people know that they're not supposed to be cheating on their spouse. Adultery is wrong. Okay? It's just built in. That's the idea. And so that argument says that morality had to come from somewhere, and the argument goes that came from God. And conscience is kind of a part of that, but we'll talk more about that later. So conscience plays in there to a point. But the idea of the moral argument, that it just tells you that there's something more there. There's this common ground. All of these arguments have been made throughout history, and not just by Christians, but by lots of people have made these kinds of arguments for the existence of God. And every one of these arguments is growing out of the general natural revelation of God. You can come to these conclusions just by paying attention to the world around you. You don't have to have any special or specific revelation coming in from outside and telling you something that you didn't know before. It's just observable, and anybody can come to this conclusion. That's the idea of the general revelation. So the cosmological or the teleological, these arguments were made by Greek philosophers way before Christ. And the historical and the moral, these have been around as well. Thomas Aquinas, you guys know that name? You know that name probably because you've encountered people who go to Aquinas College or St. Thomas Aquinas Catholic Church. So what do you know about Thomas Aquinas? Thomas Aquinas was a medieval scholar who was actually a brilliant man. And traditionally Lutherans have kind of bad-mouthed him because he was Catholic. But he's a great guy, actually, and did some really phenomenally good stuff. And Thomas Aquinas wrote a book called the Summa Theologia, the Summary of Theology, where he unpacked all kinds of stuff. And he begins one of his works by kind of tracing through the arguments for the existence of God. And he does a really nice job of unpacking all of these. His conclusion is, probably it's not adequate, but people have done these ideas trying to argue for God. What's the value in thinking about these kinds of arguments for God?
It can strengthen your faith.
It can strengthen your faith. How?
Gives you a base.
Okay, it gives you kind of a foundation, or maybe reinforces what's there. All right? True enough. In fact, probably this is really a very true thing, is that often thinking about this kind of thing is probably more beneficial for Christians than for anybody else. They benefit immensely from this. Other thoughts? What's the value in thinking about general revelation?
I think it gives you a starting point to talk to people who don't believe.
All right, this is another very valid point. This gives you a common ground, a common starting point for conversations with unbelievers. And this should not be undersold. And this is kind of a significant thing. You find common ground here, and what we're arguing is these things taken together argue for the existence of God. All right? Other thoughts?
You can give you a concrete example of God working here, something people can see and touch.
Okay, so we have God tangibly showing himself, and it's not just some kind of sort of spiritual, ethereal sort of thing. It's tangible, real. Yeah, that's good. Other thoughts?
You found out what your presuppositions are.
All right, help you to sort out your presuppositions. What do you really believe? You know, why? Where am I coming from? What am I thinking about God and where this stuff came from? Okay?
Relevance. Why argue about God if it doesn't really matter?
Okay, it is relevant. This stuff does matter. Are these arguments convincing?
To an extent. I think it depends who.
Very much, to an extent. Philosophically, every one of them has been shot down. Okay, and if you take a philosophy class, you go through the standard exercises, you look about the arguments for God, and you look at why they fail, and these have been done. But the fact of the matter is, these do hold some strength. You guys familiar with statistics? How many Americans believe in God? What's the percentage?
84%.
It's higher. Way higher. It's way up in the 90s. Way up in the 90s. I think it's like 98, 95% of Americans believe in God, which surprises a lot of us. So we're pretty much convinced we're living in a godless society, which we are. So you say, well, what doesn't add up? Well, see, the reason is because people aren't that stupid, some of the time. And so if you take a look around, what makes more sense? That this all happened by chance, or that God put it together? And obviously, it makes more sense to say somebody did this. And most of us come to that conclusion. You just start looking at the intricacy of things, the solar system. If you do any studying in science at all, and you begin to realize how intricately everything is pulled together, and it just blows you away. And it becomes harder and harder and harder to believe it just happens. And so it's actually pretty reasonable to believe in a designer and to label that God. And so most people come to that conclusion, yeah, God's there. And I would argue they're coming to that conclusion not because of special revelation, but simply because the force of the world kind of makes them come to that conclusion. They can't help it. They just are faced with that reality. So I would argue that we are really being a little bit foolish to go too quickly past general revelation or to sell it short. It has its purposes. And one of the purposes is the connection point, the kind of, the evangelism conversation. There is this, people have this sense inside that there is a God. And when somebody looks at you and says, I don't believe in God, they're probably lying. Most of the time, they're just lying. Maybe to themselves, but certainly to you. Because they're down inside, they're not nearly that convinced. They just want to be provocative, and it stirs you up, and they know it will. And so they say something like that. But down inside, push comes to shove, no, these things are pretty compelling. All right? So that's an important thing. The other thing is, this starts to lead into what we call the whole area of apologetics.